The nation of Czechoslovakia had a rich, fascinating history of animation, and in the final decade of its existence, many creative filmmakers were making bold, original work. There was quality animation in both 2D and 3D, in multiple genres, with some for kids and also lots of adult-oriented work. Easily the most famous Czech animator in the English-speaking world is Jan Švankmajer, whose career started in the 1960s. Švankmajer was a self-described surrealist who made dark, creepy films that often combined live action and stop motion. His very distinct and stylized aesthetic often included rapid editing to create dense films that were highly structured and utilized cycles and repetition. He was banned from working by the government for much of the 1970s, but the 1980s was arguably the peak of his creative output. Švankmajer made 3 adaptations of 19th century authors in the 1980s, 2 from Edgar Allan Poe, and 1 from Lewis Carroll, which was also his first feature. His first film of the decade was The Fall of the House of Usher, adapting a Gothic Poe short story from 1839 and taking directly from the text for the narration. Like several of Švankmajer's earlier films, no humans are actually shown on screen. There are human characters, but their presence is only felt indirectly, adding to the eerie, ominous tone. Also, like a lot of his work, it takes place in a dilapidated building, and stop motion makes inanimate objects come alive. In this case, chairs and a coffin. Stop motion is used throughout, but not quite as extensively as in some of his other work. Švankmajer also loved exploring textures, and here the camera slowly examines the surface of chairs and trees. Švankmajer's next short, Dimensions of Dialogue, was more typical of the style he's known for, as it's entirely built around stop motion and contains grotesque body horror. The surreal short also demonstrates Švankmajer's fascination with the 16th century Italian artist Arcimboldo, who painted human faces made up of objects such as fruits and vegetables. Like many Švankmajer films, there is no dialogue or narration. His short titled Down to the Cellar is not as centered around animation and uses stop motion more as a special effect. It is unsettling as usual with Švankmajer though, and has a horror feel as it features a girl going down into a creepy cellar where she sees a series of unexplained events. Like The Fall of the House of Usher, Down to the Cellar uses POV shots throughout. Švankmajer returned to Poe with The Pendulum, the Pit, and Hope, based on his similarly titled 1842 short story. It has a bit more of a human presence on screen than The Fall of the House of Usher, but through most of the runtime it avoids showing people's faces. Instead, it uses POV shots, focuses on hands and feet, and ends with a faceless hooded figure. Like Down to the Cellar, it only uses stop motion here and there as an effect. However, unlike Down to the Cellar, it was shot in black and white, which adds to the Gothic horror aesthetic. In 1988, after 2 decades of filmmaking, Švankmajer finally made Alice, his first feature. Like many surrealists, Švankmajer had an affinity for Lewis Carroll, and had already made a short inspired by his poem Jabberwocky in the 1970s. Alice is very unusual stylistically, as what little dialogue there is entirely narrated by Alice, with a close-up on her mouth, then followed up with her telling us who said the line. This happens throughout the entire film, and the use of repetition is common in Jan Švankmajer films. I can't confirm this, but his interest in repetition is likely influenced by the experimental structural film movement of the 1960s and 70s. There's also no music in the entire film, adding to the uncanny effect that Švankmajer so often aimed for. Švankmajer's obsession with old, worn objects is on display here, and the house the film takes place in is full of textured, imperfect surfaces. The rooms look grimy and possibly abandoned, with walls covered in peeling paint. Objects that come alive in Alice include stuffed animals filled with sawdust, skeletons, and socks. Despite excising some iconic elements of the source material like the Cheshire Cat, Švankmajer's Alice is closer to the spirit of the original than most screen adaptations. It intentionally abandons logic and is full of impossible spaces, like when Alice somehow dives into a small desk drawer. Adding to the uncanny creepiness, Alice transforms into a porcelain doll when she shrinks. There's also a slab of beef that comes alive, a theme that comes up in another Švankmajer short I'll mention later in this video. However, the film also departs from the book in major ways, like how the minimal dialogue means the exclusion of much of the wordplay and puns. Also in 1988, Švankmajer directed the absurd and grotesque short Manly Games. It depicts a soccer match where the players kill each other, Faces get torn apart in a variety of ways, such as being cut up by scissors or run through by trains. Manly Games combines live action and still photographs with stop-motion animation using cutouts and then clay for the close-ups of the players' heads being destroyed. The short is a darkly humorous satire of media, violence, and masculinity, and Schwankmayer's trademark hyperactive editing is on display here, when he rapidly cuts between images of soccer players. Manly Games also exhibits Schwankmayer's obsessions with cycles and repetition. Schwankmayer followed that up with an unsettling short that's only a minute long called Meat Love, where two pieces of meat come alive. Schwankmayer's 1989 dialogue-free short Darkness, Light, Darkness is possibly even more unnerving with its uncanny depiction of a clay body constructing itself bit by bit. It starts out with just eyeballs, before hands, feet, facial features, and a brain are formed. The being eventually becomes too big for the house it lives in and can barely move. The short film has been viewed as an allegory for various things, like politics, evolution, the life cycle of a human, and biblical creation. Schwankmayer ended the 1980s with Flora, a 30-second short, featuring decomposing vegetables, and another work of his inspired by Arsim Boldo. Another major Czech animator of the 1980s, and one influenced by Schwankmayer, was Jiří Barta, who used many different styles and tones over the course of his career. Despite the variety in his work, a few trademarks of his style are a focus on the grotesque or bizarre, and making films with minimal dialogue. Also, Barta's work often contains satire and social commentary. Barta directed one short film in the late 70s, and his second, titled The Design, came out in 1981. The unique short used a real-life hand and paper cutouts to depict the creation of a blueprint for an apartment complex. The hand is animated through a technique called pixelation, where actors are positioned frame by frame to create movement. The design critiques communist architecture and how it forced people from varying backgrounds to all live next to each other in small, uniform apartments. It also has a very creative use of music and sound effects. The film won awards at international film festivals, likely helping it avoid being banned despite being critical of official ideology. Another film using cutout animations from 1981 was Disc Jockey, an abstract short showcasing all the circles in the world around us. There is no plot, and it references lots of real-world iconography, like corporate logos and vinyl records. With cultural references and hypnotic imagery, the visual style is reminiscent of pop art and optical art. Disc Jockey is often considered a critique of consumerism, as it seems to equate it with drug addiction. Barta would return to the theme of materialism in his feature film later in the 80s. The following year, Barta changed things up and went with stop motion for The Vanished World of Gloves. The short extensively references and parodies film history, including Buñuel, Fellini, Godzilla, and Close Encounters of the Third Kind. The film is also bookended by a live-action frame story which contextualizes the clips as found footage. Barta followed that up with another dialogue-free short film, A Ballad About Green Wood. Of all Barta's work in the 1980s, this feels the most like Jan Schwankmayer, as stop motion makes wood and animals such as a raven move on their own. Like The Vanished World of Gloves, this also depicts a world mostly free of any human presence. Derived from a Slavic folktale, the pagan and mythological themed film celebrates nature and depicts the cycle of seasons. 1986 saw the release of The Pied Piper, Barta's first feature film. It's an interpretation of the famous Pied Piper of Hamelin legend from the Middle Ages, and specifically one version of it from a 1915 Czech novel. The Pied Piper has a very unique style, with distorted imagery and visuals reminiscent of German Expressionism, Cubism, and medieval German art. It's commonly compared to Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which also had twisted-looking environments with odd angles. Barta makes no attempt to be realistic, with extreme size differences between characters in the vein of medieval art. The Pied Piper uses wood puppets and real rats, both living and taxidermied. Bright colors are avoided for muted gray and brown tones. The film is quite dark tonally, almost a horror movie, and unsparing in its depiction of greed and cruelty. It also explores themes of fate and the passing of time, and references mythology with the god Saturn appearing. The Pied Piper has no dialogue whatsoever, just an invented gibberish language. It took about 2.5 years to make, and is quite impressive on a technical and artistic level. Barta's final work of the decade was the bizarre, creepy, and darkly humorous Club of the Laid Off, where mannequins that have been discarded are brought to life with stop motion. Set in an abandoned warehouse, they go about their routines and eat a meal of newspaper and red paint. Their routines are disrupted by new noisy mannequins that are ill-behaved and have more of a punk rock look. Many see the film as a metaphor for the banal, repetitive existence of the working class and an attack on conformity. After the fall of communism, Barta had trouble financing his work, and he himself referred to the Club of the Laid Off as his last auteur film. Unlike Barta, whose career was taking off, an iconic figure of Czech filmmaking whose career was winding down in the 1980s was Karel Zeman. He gained fame for films that mixed animation and live action in the 1950s and 60s, such as Invention for Destruction and The Fabulous Baron Munchausen. Unlike those films, his final work, The Tale of John and Mary, was entirely animated using cutouts, except for some live-action special effects like real water. The feature-length film uses a storybook style, with a narrator and an opening that looks like book pages. Despite the style, the content of the film is actually pretty dark and violent. Based on Czech folktales, The Tale of John and Mary is about a knight who is followed by three little imps. He eventually falls in love with a water nymph, and we get plenty of medieval tropes like a jousting tournament. Another major figure of Czechoslovakian animation was Brzezislav Pojar. He directed films beginning in the 1960s and all the way up to the 21st century, using both 2D and stop-motion animation. Pojar's dialogue-free short If was made for the United Nations with the aim of promoting peace, and imagines a utopian world using traditional animation. Pojar continued with the social commentary in the absurd short E, which attacks monarchy and tyranny. In the film, people squabble over whether a giant letter E is really a giant B. In an Orwellian dig at authoritarianism, a king shows up and confidently but incorrectly declares it a B, and the public is forced to agree by violent cops. Pojar's 1986 short Night Angel was quite different in style from those two and used relatively realistic puppets and stop motion, as well as pin screen animation. Also wordless, the Night Angel tells the story of a man who becomes blind and is then visited by an angel. After that, he directed yet another dialogue-free short, From Step to Progress, returning to 2D animation. This sci-fi short features aliens in a minimal style with few details and basic backgrounds. Czech director Zdeněk Smetana began in the 1960s, and he continued working on both film and television into the 80s. His 1980 short The Tinker's Tale was made with limited, crude, and flat-looking animation. After that, he directed a feature film called The Little Witch, a fairy tale with a talking raven. Václav Mergel directed multiple bizarre, freaky short films in the 1980s. His work was often mixed media, like the short Homunculus, that combined live action, stop motion, and traditional animation. It starts sedately with shots of paintings, but moves on to creepy dolls and eventually kaleidoscopic, fast-moving imagery. Mergel's short Microbe from 2 years later was also mixed media, using photographs and 2D animation. Microbe is darkly humorous, with oddly cute anthropomorphic microbes and a dark ending. His 1988 short Little Cousins was similarly bizarre and surreal, but with a completely different style, looking very simplistic and childlike. American animator Gene Deitch moved to Czechoslovakia in the 1960s and produced animation there for decades, including for iconic characters like Tom and Jerry and Popeye. In the 1980s, he directed short films for children, which were retellings of picture books like the horror-themed Teeny Tiny and the Witch Woman, and the jazz-scored Moon Man for Weston Woods. Vlasta Pospíšilová directed stop-motion shorts such as the wordless, darkly comic Lady Poverty and the morbid Mean Barbara. Animator Lubomir Beneš made 3 dark stop-motion shorts in the 1980s, beginning with The King and the Elf, which tells the story of King Midas and was nominated for the Short Palme d'Or at Cannes. He then made The Magician and Death, a creepy short featuring the personification of death. And finally, in 1986, he released The Horns, which depicts the life of devils while using bits of traditional animation and photography. There were also some notable animated TV shows coming out of Czechoslovakia in the 1980s. The stop-motion series Pat and Matt started in the 70s, but almost 24 episodes of the slapstick dialogue-free show were released in the 80s. Due to the collapse of the communist government in 1989, the censorship was undone, and Matt was finally allowed to wear a red shirt again, which had previously been viewed as a reference to communism. The 1980s also saw the beginning of the traditionally animated TV series Mach and Shebestova, about schoolchildren who have a talking dog and a magic phone that grants wishes. There was also the stop-motion series Yaya Apaya that began in 1986. While, like in previous decades, most of the animation was coming from the Czech side of the country, some very interesting animation was being produced in Slovakia as well. A great place to start is with director Viktor Kubal, often called the father of Slovakian animation. Kubal began the 1980s with his second feature film, The Bloody Lady, which, like a lot of his work, had no dialogue and just a bit of narration at the beginning. This 71-minute-long film is about Elizabeth Bathory, a supposed real-life serial killer from the 1500s and 1600s. The Bloody Lady is violent and a bit disturbing despite a more innocent-looking aesthetic that Kubal often used. He was known for a minimal, very loose visual style and making his animation quite quickly. The Bloody Lady also changes up its look multiple times, including a section in black and white line drawings and some live-action footage. Following that, Kubal directed What Happened to Johnny on the Road, a surreal short in his typical look where the person in the walk signal comes alive and helps a young boy cross the road. In 1987, Kubal made The Marzipan Comedy, a medium-length film at 40 minutes with minimal dialogue. In this, Kubal tells the story of Hansel and Gretel with some very unrealistic elements. Impossible things happen, like bodies stretching and morphing unnaturally. Kubal's final work of the 1980s was High Noon, a short with no dialogue. It parodies bureaucracy as characters are basic shapes and do a meaningless task in an office with sketchy backgrounds. Another important Slovakian director was Jaroslava Havetova, whose career started in the 1960s. She was the most important female Slovakian animator from this era and could be called the mother of Slovakian animation. In the 1980s, she directed multiple traditionally animated dialogue-free shorts. One example was Contacts from 1980, told in 3 parts and about normally inanimate objects like matches and pencils. Her 1986 short Restaurant used gibberish in place of dialogue and has surreal touches like a man eating his own tie and women turning into chickens. And finally, Havetova directed Deal, similarly surreal and done in a sketchy style. The 1988 film won the Short Silver Bear Award at the Berlin International Film Festival. Also from Slovakia is director Vlastimil Herold, who created shorts such as The Magician and the Flower Girl, which has a flat, slightly trippy look with vibrant colors. Vladimir Malik directed the dialogue-free short Baby in the Bank, done in a crude style and brimming with surreal events. A woman turns into a chicken and back, a man's head turns into a cash register, and a baby robs a bank with a gun. Slovakian Dagmar Bucanova directed the short A Ballad in Lace, in a very unique mode, using intricate miniature lace and brightly colored backgrounds. The short film Umbrella from Ondrej Slivka uses both black and white basic line drawings and incredibly detailed environments. Other Slovakian animators include František Jurisic, who directed short films for kids like The Wise Little Pig and Cock-a-Doodle-Doo, and Helena Slavikova-Rabarova, who worked in stop motion. I highly encourage you to check out these creative films in full, and many of them are on YouTube or Internet Archive to view for free. These Czech and Slovakian animators put their own unique stamp on the world of animation and strongly influenced later filmmakers. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.